Welcome back, everyone. I'm Katie Moore, co-host of the Women's Biohacking Conference. And today, I am so excited to be joined by Wendy and Steve. They are the founders of Women and Couples Wellness. Now, over the past 12 years, they've worked with several thousand women facing challenges ranging from pelvic health to intimacy to fertility. They hold doctorates in human sexuality from the IASHS, focusing on clinical sexology, which I didn't know was a thing until now. Wendy's background is in psychology from Ohio State, while Steve's background includes nutritional biochemistry at UNC Chapel Hill and neuroscience research at Wake Forest School of Medicine. They're creators of the high massage system and hold 6 U.S. international patents for women's pelvic health solutions. From this, they've developed natural ways to address urinary incontinence and other pelvic floor challenges that women may face. And they work closely with urologists, pelvic floor physical therapists, and fertility specialists. Wendy and Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to have kind of more of a clinical, I guess, and sort of medical kind of focused conversation around pelvic floor health and some of the things that you can do to help support this as women age. But before we get into all the nitty gritty, let's talk about your backgrounds and how you sort of stumbled into this area.
Oh, it happened by actually a tragedy. Mm-hmm. And what happened is it took us a while to get pregnant.
5 years.
5 years. And my OBGYN was like, well, you guys should start trying because you're not getting any younger. So we went through all the fertility treatments and everything. And we fortunately got pregnant. But then I got a really bad infection called C. diff, visiting his mom in a recovery facility after a hip surgery. And so, unfortunately, I just was in and out of the hospital and had bad tissue adhesions because I had to have emergency C-section. So, just had terrible, side effects of that and, tissue adhesions. So we really had to focus on pelvic floor health from a necessity for our, own well-being and everything.
It was really a horrible. We lost a little boy, Lucas. Mm-hmm. He lived today, but and then that version of C. diff was resistant to every known antibiotic at the time, and for 2 years in and out of ICU because they have her own IV antibiotics, and then take her off and come back. And finally, the Mayo Clinic found an antibiotic that cleared it, but they'd had to do multiple surgeries from complications and. Her large intestine and her small intestine is attached to her uterus, and it would get kinked off every now and then. And I'd worked in neuroscience work, but did a major pivot in the mid 90s to co-found a series of tech companies. And I was working in government software at the time, a company I co-founded in. But I worked in or had an interest in studying massage and Asian techniques since I was 8 with Tai Chi and Qigong and all sorts of I know a lot about martial arts, and I'm not very good at it, though. So,
well, don't worry. I'm not going to quiz you on anything.
Not Jackie Chan.
Don't worry. We're not going down that road.
I don't go on the tournament circuit, but I knew a lot about tissue adhesions, but nothing that was about that deep in her belly. And I finally found a technique called the Wern technique from Clear Passage Therapy in Florida, where basically the person would lay on a table and the therapist would rock their belly.
It's a vigorous hand shot. Yeah.
Yeah. And that would literally jostle the intestines to help, if it was kinked, to unkink it. We first heard about it from an ER doctor, when we were having an issue. He was a gentleman from India, and he did that. And the problem was I was traveling a lot, and they said that if you did that therapy once a day or ideally twice a day for 20 minutes, that it could actually help free up tissue adhesions. The problem was I was traveling most of the time because with this.
So he's trying to automate it. So
yeah, and none of the PTs locally would do it because they weren't familiar with that technique, and it wasn't well standardized, and they were concerned about it and all this other stuff. So I first tried to make a device that shook her I took a washing machine motor and that made her throw up. That wasn't a good, I tried to mimic. So then I started thinking, okay, well, what's going on? And it occurred to me that her uterus, her intestine is attached to her uterus, and there are these ligaments called the broad ligament, and a few others that suspend down that keep the uterus and the ovaries up. Otherwise, they'll collapse down to the base of the pelvic floor. Mm-hmm. And probably that rocking motion was moving the uterus through that ligament. So I thought, well, what if you could get the ligament to shake like that, like a whip? And so I started experimenting with percussive massagers, which I had a bunch of them because I'd done massage quite a bit, but nothing would penetrate deep enough in her belly. It wasn't painful, at least. Like the heavier duty ones are painful, and don't use those on your belly. But so I literally,
so a lot of R&D went into this.
Yeah,
but finally, our end result, had basically for me broke up the tissue adhesions.
Which we're not making any medical claims. That is documented with other studies from third-party groups for percussive massage. But this is where it gets really weird. So I guess hold on.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I have so many questions.
Go ahead.
Well, here's the weird part. I had this contraption in a big lawnmower. It sounded like a lawnmower. It's a big PVC tube. I was not an engineer, and it's really loud. I'm using it on her belly, and it was January, Sunday afternoon. I'm holding it on her belly, and she's like, "Yeah, hold it right there." I'm like, "Okay." And then she starts turning pink. I'm like, "Are you okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, hold it there." And a moment later, bam, she has an orgasm.
Oh,
yeah.
This, I told you, got weird.
And that was not expected.
No.
Yeah, that was not expected for me either.
For so many months. Yeah.
That's where it made it very difficult to commercialize because basically I'd done patent work previously in the tech industry, and she's like, "Do that again," because she'd had a lot of issues with that area from the surgery and the illness and the trauma and everything else. And they said we never get pregnant again and all this stuff. And it worked consistently on her. So I thought, well, can you ask some of your friends to try this thing and get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement and all that stuff? So she did, and she talked to them. And, for the women that had C-section surgeries or hysterectomies, it worked. But for women that hadn't, they'd turn slightly pink and think, well, it's relaxing, but, I'm not sure what's going on there, but it's okay. But so fast forward a long time, I go back to Wake Forest. I asked my old boss to sign an NDA because it was a Center for Investigative Neuroscience, and nobody, it was undefined nerve, at least at that time. But long story, nobody would they wouldn't work on it because of the side effect. They literally said, if I can guarantee that it won't do that. So we looked at NIH, all this other stuff. And I got
the side effect being an orgasm for a woman.
Yeah, yes.
Just to be clear. Okay.
For a reason we couldn't explain why at the time. Now we found out why later. But so that's
of all the nerves and everything connected in that area. And, we'll go into all the positive side effects and everything later. But,
Barry Komisarek and Beverly Whipple at Rutgers University, unknown to me at the time, had actually shown that the distal branch of the vagus nerve actually innervates the uterus. And they had shown women that had complete spinal cord cuts could experience what they thought was vaginal orgasm from their partner. So they put these women in functional MRIs and they did scans, and they found, what do you know? Basal nucleus in the brainstem, secondary pathway. It was the vagus nerve. So that was already characterized. I found out later. I've talked with Barry quite a bit. But again, fast forward quite a long time. We ended up getting our doctorates at ISHS because all the other institutions would not study this stuff real time. And that was one of the most controversial schools out there. They were open to that.
And that's when we were able to study, the use on several women for strengthening pelvic floor muscles and all kinds of.
And what we ended up modifying the device quite a bit.
I'm sure she's got her next question.
So please go ahead. That's I told you. Let's hold on to your seats. It's crazy.
I had a list of questions. I'm throwing those out the window because this just, I have so many questions.
Sure.
Where to start? Okay. Let's start with like the maybe the big overarching thing. So why do you think that it was so controversial to study this? Is that still the landscape? Because to me, this sounds like medical, like something more, it doesn't sound taboo. It like you're coming at it from a clinical perspective. I can't believe it was rejected at so many institutions. Why is that the case?
That's a very good question.
To put it shortly, sexology that is funded in the United States historically has been studied third person past tense. In other words, based on these surveys, people have said, blah, blah, blah. We were first person present tense. Mm-hmm. Now, I wasn't even we were looking at severe chronic bladder and urinary tract infections and urinary incontinence. But that's another area. We
were on track to try to do a FDA study, but it ended up that the contact we had moved, and then it was just sort of a track to try to
you get stuck in a catch-22.
Yeah, kind of a catch-22 at the time to get a grant or anything.
We didn't have a manufactured device, and they said to do the pilot study to decide if you want to further develop it to produce a device, you actually have to have a pilot with a human with a FDA-approved device. So it's like, how do you make a device when you don't have the device? So we ran a crowdfunding. The first one failed. The second one, we raised $115K, and our first investor is
on Indiegogo.
Yeah. And our first investor is the manufacturer. We're the only company he's ever invested in. So he looked at this very carefully. We successfully delivered, and then we got a venture capital fund to fund us for a seed fund. So that's how we got here.
Yeah.
But that's, again,
and
crazy.
The final design was actually designed by female engineers.
Okay, so let's backtrack. I think you said it was C. diff, right? Is that the correct term? I've actually never heard of this before. How common is this for women to get? And does this only happen during pregnancy?
Well, it actually affects the digestive system. So it'll go through the digestive system, and it's a bug that it's kind of scary. Steve can explain the details, but it will actually hook into the intestine, and it causes constant diarrhea. So, I mean, if I were to drive to work like for 30 minutes or something like that, I would have had to stop literally 10 times to go to the bathroom.
It sounds like a parasite, right? Like almost.
Yes.
Well, it's a bacteria.
Kind of, it has a side effect like a parasite.
It's Clostridium difficile, which is a bug that there's small amounts of in everybody. The challenge is most C. diff or Clostridium difficile can be treated with 2 antibiotics, Flagyl and vancomycin. This was resistant to even those 2 antibiotics, and most C. diff variants are 3 toxin variants. This was a 5 toxin variant. So it not only made you much sicker, you couldn't kill it. And my mom was having a hip replacement, and her roommate had terrible diarrhea, and the people didn't do anything about it. Thankfully, my mom didn't get out of the bed at the time. Yeah. Wendy went to the restroom in that room. She got exposed to it. Yeah. It's horribly contagious. And it's rampant
common in nursing homes and hospitals. Yeah.
So that's another long, complicated story, but she got that. We didn't know what was wrong, was having terrible diarrhea, getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And then 2 months before the due date, they had to do the emergency C-section.
So it was really the loss of nutrition, the side effect of it, that caused the loss of the pregnancy.
And the thing was that now here's, again, hold on to your seats again. We were told we could never get pregnant, and due to the damage, the fallopian tubes, the uterus. So we should look at adopting. And, we weren't happy about that. And all the doctors would avoid the topic, at when he would see the doctor. Well, then in 2012, Wendy starts getting all these crazy symptoms.
And I was feeling emotional, and then upset at myself for feeling emotional. Like, why am I feeling so emotional?
I'd come home, and she'd be upstairs at the far end of the house crying. And I'm like, why are you crying? She's like, I'm mad at myself.
I don't know why I'm crying.
Like, she's normally upbeat all the time.
Yes. And so I went to a regular skin checkup and told my symptoms, leg cramps, I'm getting skin molt.
That's after 7 doctors in 24 weeks.
Yes. And you know how you hear the story of there have been stories of the baby being born in the prom, and you're like, how could a girl carry a baby that long and not know it? Well, all the specialists were looking at different parts of my body, and thank God I didn't have any x-rays. So
It was a high school assistant.
it was a high school assistant at the checkup. She said, "Sounds like you're pregnant." So on the way home, we went to CVS, or if it was a pharmacy, it may have been CVS, and just got, one of the test sticks. I'm like, hey, look, we're pregnant, honey.
24 weeks pregnant. Yeah, we have a wonderful little girl named Daniela Kepler.
Yeah.
So,
No way. Okay. Whoa. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Was this after you had broken up the tissue using this device?
Yeah.
Yes. Now we can't make medical claims about
No.
that.
I know.
We're popular
Yeah.
in Asia for that. We sell in several countries. Yeah.
I'm putting my own conclusions together. I'm not saying you're saying this. It's coming out of my mouth, so anybody can, blame me. Just interesting. I'm just going to say, wow. Okay. Another question. I follow up. Did you say you were using it externally on the stomach, and that's what caused it? This crazy evolution. The original device was external on the abdomen, and for women that had surgery, it varies from woman to woman. After I got so angry and Wendy was also having some pelvic pain issues and other areas, I just got so frustrated that the medical researchers wouldn't touch it unless, I literally tried to figure out, how do you eliminate that side effect? But at the time I didn't know what was going on.
Patient compliance. It's perfect.
And this is another big thing. In talking about urinary incontinence, I'm like, well, heck, if they're freaked out about women's pleasure, I'll optimize it for women's pleasure. And then I thought, well, how does that work? And I got out because I've been doing graduate work in physiology. I had, because that's before. I'm like, there's you got hypogastric nerve, pudendal nerve, pelvic nerve. What the heck's up there? And later we found out it was the vagus nerve, but we shifted it so it can be used this way. And this was actually a guide originally. So the woman would go like that, but this is totally external. It can be genes, whatever. This generates a waveform that travels about that deep. And it's a long story because this can vibrate. This is percussion. It goes in 4 hertz increments. So 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. Long story about that. But nerves can feel 4 different channels. And most people don't realize that. This can talk on all 4 different channels with the right combinations. And it stimulates every known nerve that's there simultaneously. We also later,
like an orchestra.
So you're not just hitting the pudendal nerve. You're hitting, pudendal nerve, hypogastric nerve, the sacral plexus at the bottom, which a lot of our work, we later found, what's ironic, this is also optimized for a certain length for the pubic bone with women. So this is above and below for this position. That is the perfect position behind the neck where the branches of the vagus nerve go out. And it's the perfect position for your lumbar plexus on your lower back. So
on each side of the spine. So it's the golden ratio.
It keeps showing up at different spots on the body, for different nerves. So basically I got so annoyed. I'm like, well, okay, I'll make something for women's pleasure. And we made this thing. Actually, my first thing looked like Frankenstein, literally. It was, and I went to investors because I had been an advisor in the tech industry, because they'd come to me, the VC, and they'd say, what do you think about this company? What do you think about that company? And originally, they're not going to like this, but frankly, they acted like high school kids. And like, okay, we'll demonstrate it. So Wendy and I got models to go in, and then they totally freaked out. And some just would never talk to me again.
Those will be all different stories at a later time.
Yeah. So you, I'm sorry, hold on, time out. So you brought women in to demonstrate the side effects
because
of
they
this.
didn't believe the videos. Yeah.
And like yoga pants, like workout.
Totally. Yep. I got it. Clear vision. Yeah, of course.
But it basically got me, after I did that, now my old company that I co-founded, does land records software for the government. And that is a very conservative market. And a good friend who's a very, very wealthy guy came to me and took me out to lunch and said, Steve, here's the deal. You need to take that crazy contraption, stick it on your belt, and just lay low. You need to disappear for about 3 months. And what I'm going to do is go around and tell everybody that you basically had a midlife crisis from losing your son and from all this stuff. And for you made a crazy device, but now you're over it. Just never speak of it again, and you'll be back. Everything will be cool. And he said, now, if you don't, it's going to destroy your company. And I'd worked 15 years on that company. And so I go home. This is where urinary incontinence comes up. I go home and I tell Wendy this, and this was before we had the little girl, and she's, kind of fatalistic. And she's like, well, if we make it to 80, won't we always wonder if this worked or not? And I'm like, yeah, but, it's a... And I said, well, if Luke had lived after we're gone, since this does, at least for us, seem to help with urinary incontinence and urinary tract infections and all that, what would he be more proud of after we're gone? Land records or helping millions of women? So I retired from the company the next week.
Wow. And you followed your heart.
And that wasn't easy.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
So that's the urinary incontinence issue. I mean, women's pleasure is a wonderful thing and it's an important part of life. But the fact that there were potential real health benefits and it's getting ignored because of that really didn't. Now, I was naive. I didn't know how crazy the process
a roller coaster ride. Yeah.
But actually manufacturing. But
and I mean, I'd love to kind of talk a little bit more about that. I understand kind of now some of the side effects, and I think that's definitely, some people will be interested in knowing about that. But I think for the UTIs, the incontinence, I want to talk about how this could potentially, I know we can't say any medical claims, but how this could, what's the mechanism of action that could facilitate in helping those issues?
For UTIs or for...
Let's start with UTIs. Yeah.
Well, the majority, there are 10 common urinary tract infection and bladder infection bugs. All of them share a characteristic that they form biofilms. In other words, they hook onto the mucous membrane and they form this little gel. And
like the gel that's on your shower door, or a pool, kind of sludgy if you don't clean it.
Yeah. The challenge is... a woman will get a UTI. Men don't get UTIs usually until later in life, and then it really gets them. But we have some videos of some wonderful people that had been on IV antibiotics for 2 years, and then introduced that adjunct approach in conjunction under our main urology advisor, Dr. Corey, and now they're free of the infection. But again, I'm not making claims about that, but I can send you links to that. Imagine you got a gel, that's that thick. That's a few millimeters or less than millimeters. And somebody drops in an antibiotic and it's in the bladder or it's on the urethral lining. And the antibiotic penetrates 99% into it, but doesn't get to the very bottom. You kill off 99% of it, but there will be a tiny bit that remains, and it grows very slowly, and it's been exposed to that antibiotic, so it's possible that only the ones that had randomly become resistant will, grow. And they form these little things that form gels, and then it's called a bloom. You don't really feel the pain until the thing pops open, and a lot of them come out, and then they attach everywhere and cause inflammation. Well, you add this antibiotic, and you gently swish it around. Well, let's think about an analogy of say you have a can of paint an empty paint can outside. It's sat outside for a year. It's got a gel on the inside. You drop an antibiotic pill into it and you just very gently kind of move it around. Well, you kill 99%. Now imagine dropping that pill, putting the lid on it, sticking it in a paint shaker, and you shake it. What this does is it generates a shock wave that travels into the bladder. And it shakes everything. It generates a tremendous shock wave through the urethral channel. And if you have a therapeutic agent, which antibiotics would be under the care of a doctor, D-mannose has had wonderful benefits for some women. The studies vary, but I'm a firm believer in it. Other types of herbal prep, kalanji is one herb that's wonderful. But the challenge is if you've got that gel, you've got to get it down into it. Now, D-mannose wouldn't kill it. It would just help prevent it from sticking. But those are things that we suggest under the care of a doctor. That's out of our domain. And one thing I want to emphasize, we are not medical doctors. We're not providing advice, to be clear about that.
We work with
disclaimer,
doctors.
So basically, if you have something that can cause the infection to go away, an antibiotic, whatever. This helps it potentially get to it better. And in the case like with Andy Davis, he's a retired family practice doctor down in Texas. He had a stroke and developed a terrible bladder infection with a bug called Klebsiella pneumonia. And the oral antibiotics stopped working. Then they put him on IV antibiotics, and it got down to he was on vancomycin, IV vancomycin, and that was it. And he knew it was going to become resistant and was going to kill him. And he was seeing Dr. Corey. Dr. Corey suggested he try a bladder inflation technique that Dr. Lenz developed down there, where they inflate the bladder with antibiotic and other kinds of agents, and they do that twice a week. But they'd done that for about a year, and it would help, but the infection would always come back. Yeah. So then they added this on his belly, and long story short, he started expelling gelatinous material in his urine.
Whoa.
Of it over about a period of a week. And within 90 days of doing that, this was 2020, I think, or I remember, send you the video, he's been free of that infection.
Yeah.
So again, did that. And Dr. Corey basically suggests that as a alternative adjunct. It's not a replacement. It is not, I need to be very careful about that.
If there is an infection, antibiotics would be needed, but combining both breaks down the building blocks or the houses of the infection. So.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
In that case, having male candidates, ironically, tends to get through a little bit faster.
Wonder why that is. I mean, like if you look historically at so many studies across the board for all sorts of, health issues, it's generally men who are the candidates. And that's why it's so important that we have things like the Women's Biohacking Conference, because we are shining light on some real health issues for women that may have not been studied or looked at. And so, just giving people information and then they can make their own decisions. Wanted to quickly, before we get to the urinary incontinence, which we're definitely going to talk about, what about kidney stones?
Good question.
Kidney stones I have a good friend who's a nephrologist that ended up getting a kidney stone. And he was like, man, he did not realize how painful
they are.
For percussive massage on the back, it could, there are treatments that are FDA approved where you basically sit in a tub of water and they have this device that sends a sonic shock wave that the goal is to shatter. That's actually a sensitive point for me. There's drug therapies to try to help dissolve that actually was for my mom. Well, I don't even know. My mom died a horrible death during COVID because she got a kidney stone, went to a small hospital. They gave her a drug to release it, but they didn't have dialysis machines. They plugged both of her ureters, and then they couldn't transfer her out because she'd been in a room with COVID patients. She didn't die of COVID. She died 14 days later because her kidneys were plugged and she couldn't. But yeah, that's another topic. But I can't comment on kidney stones because we don't have any data on that. Now, for kidney stones, if you have a tendency for that, you can avoid certain foods that are high in oxalates and try to drink lemon juice every day for the citric acid. That tends to help. I know my friend, the nephrologist, drinks his lemon drink every day now for the kidney stone because I was just thinking
with the way it would maybe potentially break it up, like kind of the film that you're talking about. That's sort of where my mind went because I had a friend who had a really hard time passing a kidney stone. And, so I was just food for thought.
The short answer is I really don't know. I would be cautious. I always tend to err on the side of caution, with this because kidney stones also, to my the limited degree of knowledge I have about it, by the nature of the crystals, they tend to be very jagged and sharp. And if you break that thing loose and you're shaking it around, that you wouldn't want to cause more damage. If there's a nephrologist that wants to research that, I am all for that. I mean, one of our methods we teach is where you massage you hold it here for a little while, and then if you have a partner, you go very slowly down your back, and you definitely the kidneys are kind of to the side and behind the ribs, but you definitely send the reason this is different is what I was doing is I took a percussive massager apart and I got a piece of aluminum from Home Depot and I kept moving the head farther out because it'd make it go farther out. And I was massaging like the palmaris longus, because with a lot of massagers, they'll massage down to there. I finally found the right height of it going out that it made my finger shake. And I thought if it would go all the way up there, maybe it'd go into Wendy's belly. Now, I learned a lot of stuff. I almost burned the house down because
I mean, yeah,
garage is separate from the house. Yeah.
That's I mean, that's how all like so many origin stories start, though. It's like you have a problem, you're trying to fix it. You go to all extremes, in which case, like you get rejected 100 times over. And then finally, when you were really that passionate and people like actually can see some of the benefit, that's when things start to happen with companies. So I mean, I love your origin story because it's just so part of like the everyday entrepreneur journey that people go through. So I don't know much about urinary incontinence, but I know you guys are well versed in this. So can you just kind of paint me a broad scope of how common this is with women and when it typically happens in their stage of life? I feel like it's more postmenopausal, but I might be incorrect.
Well, with urinary incontinence, do you want me to keep? There are two general categories of urinary incontinence. The first is urge incontinence, which is where you suddenly get this feeling like, oh my God, I got to go to the bathroom. And sometimes if you don't, you will lose your urine. And that is separate in many ways from what would be called stress-based incontinence. Stress-based incontinence basically is when you cough or laugh or you happen to move a certain way, you notice urine leakage. Now, that can progress to full-blown urinary incontinence where you have no control over that. My mom also had that issue, and in her case, for her, I didn't know what was going on at the time, but she fell on her steps one winter and hit her back right above her sacrum. And hurt her back and she had urinary incontinence that day onward for the rest of her life. So you got two groups. One is the urge, which you might not lose urine unless you go to the bathroom, but women are going to the bathroom every 30 minutes for that, or waking up in the middle of the night. The other is where you lose control. Now, to understand it, it's good to kind of know a little bit about what's actually going on with urination and all. And Wendy, punch me if I ramble too much, but basically when urine is produced, it comes down the ureters. I should have had some diagrams. And there's a little, almost like one-way valve at the bottom of the bladder, and it fills up. Now, what happens is when the bladder fills, there are little sensors, nerves, that send a signal to the base of your spine. And it then sends a relay back when it measures a certain amount of tension that causes it to want to contract, to expel the urine. When you're a baby, you'll just urinate whenever you hit that point. As we get older, we get more control, and it also sends data up to our brainstem, and it tells us, hey, you got to go to the bathroom. And we have more control of it, where we can actually physically control the sphincter. Now, another big thing, and there's some debate in medical anatomy and all about this, there are two sphincters. There's an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. The external sphincter you can control. When you want to go to the bathroom, I mean, I don't know this from a woman's perspective, but from a male, you go, you think about it, okay, I'm going to go. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. That at least,
or you get distracted, you have to go really bad and you get distracted with something or a call, and then you don't have to go until you really have to go. And then if you can't, well, that's because there's that internal sphincter that has to relax and open up. And now there's a lot of fuss and debate in female anatomy because the sphincter in women some people say it's not even there. It's very tiny below the bladder. But basically, there's kind of a reflex arc that when you say urinate here, it should send a reflex action and you learn that as probably when you're 3 or 4 or 5, years old. So the bladder fills, it gets an immediate signal to contract, but then when you're older, you can keep it in. Now with urge incontinence, something is irritating your bladder saying, hey, you're too full, and you might only have a tiny amount of urine in your bladder.
but it'll clamp down and say, you got to go to the bathroom. In stress-based incontinence, the thing to think about is the pelvic floor muscles are about as thick as your pinky, and maybe a little bit thicker depending on persons. And the internal urinary sphincter is sitting up there on the bladder, and then there's a sphincter you've got three muscles that are like little slings that sit in the bottom of your pelvic floor. And all sorts of things can go wrong. But the reason I'm mentioning that is a lot of times with, say, whatever kind of approaches, they'll focus on one thing. They'll focus on strengthening the pelvic floor or giving you a drug to knock out that contraction reflex.
Kind of like with our background, one doctor was looking at my belly, one at the liver, one at my skin, and, bringing it all together, looking at the whole picture. Yeah.
Yes, because it's a concert that's going on, and most of the concert you're not even aware of. It's going on, behind the scenes. And so if the muscles, two big things can happen with stress-based urinary incontinence. Number one, our sedentary seated lifestyle allows those muscles to become weak, and also the seated position. There's a lot of debate, and I don't really know the answer, but quite a large number of people believe that if people sat in the squatting position more, where your legs are up and, like squatting.
Like toddlers do naturally.
Now, if you're 65, don't go do that right now. But basically, the way the hip shifts and the psoas, the deep internal muscles, they stretch a little more. It seems like we should squat, and we should also hang by our arms once a day to help decompress the spine. But basically, those muscles become weak and flaccid, and they'll kind of give way a little bit. And the problem is that urethra the sphincter on the urethra, if one side slides, if it's like this and one side slides, it can't close quite right if it's going down. A lot of the pelvic sling surgeries where they run a little loop under the urethra, that pulls things up to try to keep it in alignment. Now, many approaches, Kegels, where you contract the urogenital diaphragm, for a lot of women, they will help. However, if you have a challenge where you had an injury from pregnancy or
like your mom falling.
Well, that's another thing. Well, let's say it's in the pelvic floor muscles. If there's an injury on one side and you do a Kegel, you may cause a spasm. And you actually could make that. Now, on average, Kegels are great. But in some women, so I don't want to say don't do Kegels. In some women, it can make the spasm worse, and it can cause things to shift. Because if you got the muscle, if again it's here and the muscle's pulling it off that way, it makes it worse. Now, the other big thing is if you have either damage to the nerves, the pelvic and pudendal, hypogastric nerves in particular, things mess up. If you have stress and compression in those areas. Another area that I worked with a great deal when we were doing our grad research was these areas called the sacral plexus, because the sacral nerves, which are mostly parasympathetic or relaxation nerves by their definition, they all come out on each side, but they go together inside each, into little nodes in each side of the buttocks. And they're they don't know what they do. We have a lot of those things in our body where it's like a little middle management center, mini brain. Then they branch back out. What I found was for women that were anorgasmic or had pelvic pain, and later we looked at urinary incontinence, they tended to have a lot of stress, and they would keep those muscles locked tight. So, and again, there's not very much research on this, and even if there was, you'd need large numbers to be able to get a clear answer.
Sitting all day doesn't help because it squeezes those areas on both sides and the circulation.
So the compression, the sitting causes the muscles to atrophy. It can mess up nerve flow. Now, as far as the classic, what are the big reasons? The biggest reason is natural childbirth with pregnancy. And that would be kind of obvious, having everything to dilate like that. You might get a tear, you might get damage. With the Ferticare that Orion Medical sells, that is commonly given to women going home from natural childbirth to use in France, but not here. There are many things. If you had an epidural during your childbirth and the muscles are you have totally screwed up how those nerves work for 6, 12, 24 hours because they're drugged.
Mhm.
Well, you got those muscles randomly spasming, not knowing what to do. And if you have a tear, it can enhance the damage. So there are a lot of things with natural childbirth that can increase it. Being heavy, overweight, as far as lifting things, or when you're pregnant, lifting something, that's dangerous, for increasing the chances of that. Smoking is heavily associated with increased urinary incontinence. And there's a more sinister reason to that I often tell when I have discussions, with groups and related to sexology and things like that. There's a huge focus on male erectile dysfunction. And and this will make sense here in a second for urinary incontinence. If you imagine the arteries in a male anatomy, if they're this big, the arteries, that's about 1/10 the size of the heart. If they're getting clogged and you're having ED from that, by the time you're 40, your odds of having a stroke or heart attack 20 years later are horribly high. What they don't mention is the arteries in women's pelvic areas are 1/10 the size of that. And they get the same thing. The same blockages. Right. And many of the challenges
you don't hear about it at all.
Yeah, it's not talked about, not even known by most. Many of the challenges associated with just getting older, it must be menopause, is actually decreased circulatory function. So it's not just everything's losing tissue integrity because you're not exercising or sitting or the pressure, you're not getting as much circulation to your pelvic area. So that's another huge and as far as them being 1/10 the size, that's in the mainly the reproductive tissue for that. But
so quick question though, because this is great information, and I feel like I'm gonna have to rewatch this and take a bunch of notes. How does the compression help with something like urinary incontinence then?
When you mean compression, do you mean
like the device, right? Because if we're talking.
Yes, it strengthens the whole pelvic area. And so the system, we have 3 exercises. So it's basically just 6 minutes a day where you go over the belly area. We have a video of it, of a woman using it. And you can just use it over clothes. It even works over jeans, but something comfortable like yoga pants. There's 3 positions and it strengthens the whole pelvic area.
Wow. Yes, as far as what it does. Now, we're not making claims about that, but other studies of muscle tissue with percussive massage have shown that. But basically, what it does is a few things. Number one, it squeezes the tissue to force the blood and the lymph flow out. So it increases circulation and lymphatic flow. There's some debate, and there are some doctors we know that are very curious for helping with circulatory flow for other things, but that's still got to be researched. So that's one area. Another area that is huge is certain types of percussive frequencies can induce something called myotactic reflex contraction. And what that is if you go to a doctor and they hit your elbow or your knee and you move your arm, that's myotactic reflex. They do that to make sure that that movement actually didn't make it to your brain. Your muscle moved before it even got there. And it's a reflex arc from your spine and back. Well, when you strike muscles at certain speeds, they will spontaneously contract in response. And the myotactic, that whole system allows us to stay balanced. We'd be falling over and flopping and all that's going on thousands of times a second all over our body. Well, when you do the percussion on the pelvic floor, you are inducing myotactic reflex contractions in all of the pelvic muscles. And there are 2 positions for that. So basically, you are profoundly increasing the circulation and inducing that beneficial effect. Now, there have been studies on the Ferticare, and I can send you the links to it. The crazy thing is, it was never followed up in the U.S., and they got stonewalled. In Denmark, it's transcutaneous nerve stimulant. I forget I'll get you a link to it. What they found was with their device, which has a shorter range percussive movement. It looks like a big toothbrush with a head on it. For women, if they used it once a day for 6 weeks, they had a 73% resolution. I'm referencing that article. A 73% resolution, meaning they no longer experience stress-based urinary incontinence within 6 weeks. They then followed up with those women after stopping it, and after 90 days or 3 months, 67% of the women said they still were free of stress-based urinary incontinence. So there is, and they did quite a few other studies in Denmark with that, but that's another reason we went to the ISHS, because the group worked with them. But but basically, Orion Medical took that to the United States, and they were just coming out with the cholinergic drugs for urinary incontinence. And they shifted the rules for getting Class 2 approval to where you have to have a sham device that has identical appearance and function, that you then do a double-blind trial. And how do you do identical appearance and function with a physical device that's stimulating a specific spot? So they created a catch-22 to make it. Now, you can get approvals for milder claims and all, but to get it for insurance, which, and that's another big issue. We're looking at resolution, if possible. We're not looking at an ongoing drug you have to take, or an ongoing. There are many things, we can mention later with alternative therapies, where women sit down on a magnetic chair, and then they're sold 6 sessions over 6 weeks for $100 to $300 per session. That induces muscle contraction, many things like that, but they're pay-to-play ongoing models. They're not, something that will hopefully resolve the issue. I mean, we're in this to try to help people. So
it's very clear, and I love that you guys are like a team too, and it's it's nice. It's something that, again, we have in this in this country, at least, it's been so taboo to talk about these things, and I think we're finally getting past that. And we're now looking at it from the lens of like, yes, we're talking about it. And yes, we're talking about some of the issues that women are having. And so I really do appreciate us kind of getting nerdy in the science. We are coming up on time, but I do have one kind of last question. So I'm 35, don't plan to have kids. I'm in pretty good health. Why would I need to use the device? Or why would you recommend it?
Several reasons. Number one, maintaining overall pelvic health is critical for long-term health. Because when we talk about urinary incontinence, we group it in with, we call it womanhood 3.0. It's
strengthening the whole pelvic floor area.
Yes, and it's a routine that you use nightly behind your neck, on your lower back, because if you're trying to relax and whatever you're doing, if you have tension in these muscles, the nerves that are trying to tell your body to relax aren't going to work as well. If you have severe compression or tension in your lower back, they're not going to work as well. So it's a way to sleep better at night and get better recovery. And a key thing with that you might find interesting, and I'd be happy to send you links to the information. Dr. David Weeks was the first person that researched this, but several others later in Europe. The attention that tends to get the study that got the most attention was of about 3,500 people, mostly women, where he was studying how some people seem to age so much more slowly than others. And what they would do is they had women from 18 to in their 70s volunteer to walk into a room. There was a 2-way or whatever you call it mirror where there's a group of 10 people behind it. And they're sitting in these little chairs. And the woman would walk in, say her name, turn around, walk out. And then they would rate these little things, how old they thought she was, how healthy they thought she was, all sorts of other things. Then she sat down at a desk and filled out this really long, like 30-page questionnaire about her lifestyle, what she did she smoke, did she have kids, blah, 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 blah. And what they found was kind of interesting. The second, for women and with men, but more so in women, significantly more so, a certain group of women tended to look on average 10 years younger than their chronological age. And this was, this study actually was in Scotland. These weren't biohackers, stuff. This was long before. And the second most common thing among those women was they did moderate aerobic exercise 3 to 5 days a week. But by far the most common distinction was they had 3 to 4 orgasms a week.
Oh, okay.
No joke. And that's not talked about here.
Yeah.
So as far as, and this will make sense here in just a minute. What has been found later in multiple studies is in women premenopausal, when they get stressed and you have your DHEA that your kidneys, you make while you sleep deeply, and that's converted either into cortisol or it's converted into estrogen or testosterone or, several different things. When your oxytocin, and in some studies, vasopressin levels drop because you've had a stressful day, blah, 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 collagen synthesis decreases. And if you're looking
even before menopause.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at pelvic health, collagen synthesis is one of the key things for tissue integrity. It's also for wrinkles and all that fun stuff. So what they found was if women had orgasms about once every 48 hours, and they could also have really good caring, cuddling, and stuff like that to make them feel, the big thing is to feel safe and cared for and be able to go to sleep in that state. But for the women that did that, they age significantly slower. So part of our Womanhood 3.0 program basically looks at that as well. So this isn't just the orgasm is the ultimate biohack to reset your parasympathetic system and modulate a lot of hormones.
Yeah, some people believe we're in a computer simulation. If we are, I think that's the reboot for females, it's the orgasm.
Yeah, and that we could go on and with details about. But as far as the health benefits, for us, the being able to massage each night and having that to reset the system, because there are other things. There's a significant difference neurologically between a clitoral orgasm mediated by the pudendal nerve and vaginal cervical orgasm, which is vagus mediated. Long story about that. But
another day.
But the big thing for long-term health for women, it's just a great tool. Now, if you're in a relationship, we have a program called the 3-step method, where you just massage the back very slowly, the sacral plexus on the rear, and then if either partner wants, the pelvic area. Now, the deal is on one day a week, partner one massages the other, and it is 100% for the other's benefit. No expectation. No expectation. Yeah. And then on another day, not on the same day, partner two does it for partner one. And it gives both people something, because another thing we do with coaching for relationships, we've been married 21 years and, had our ups and downs and all that stuff. Yeah. But we've seen so many trends, and if couples have a ritual that they can do once a week that they really enjoy, and what this does is it helps reset things. So that would be the biggest benefit, to prevent ever having to deal with urinary incontinence issues, hopefully, to prevent potential urinary tract infections, potentially, again, not to prevent potential issues with pelvic pain. We have a variation of the Weiss-Anderson protocol, which is a pelvic pain protocol developed at Stanford that is totally external over clothing. So those are the big things. But I kind of got off on natural. I know you got natural approaches. Basically, the biggest thing is making sure that the pelvic floor muscles are strengthened and the nerve connections are valid. Now, how do you do that? Well, the first thing you have to do is realize that this is part of your learning process in life. Yeah, it sucks you got this, but don't identify with it. Then what we suggest people do is we form little groups where women have training partners, and one person has a training partner that they report to every couple of days. Did you do your Kegels? Did you do this? Did you do this? The little checklist, and it goes over exercise routines, stretching routines, sleep, de-stress routines, and ideally intimate time as well. And they, not with those two people, but if they're in relationships or whatever.
Not with those two.
And then once a month, they report back to a bigger group to keep both of them accountable. Because the biggest issue with the natural approaches, and I didn't even go into those. I'll have a link to more details about that. Is compliance. Is the two big issues are either they focus on just one aspect and not the whole picture, or there's not compliance. And like with Kegels, one thing I was going to mention, there's new research about Kegels that if you do the Kegel and then you contract your abdominal core muscles and your hip and thigh muscles simultaneously, extremely tensely, that appears to give profoundly better benefit than just doing the Kegel alone. So there's a lot of new research out about, that stuff as well. So,
Wow. Well, I mean, I think we'll definitely include all those articles, but beneath the video so that people have access and really be able to educate themselves. Where can they get access to this product? Can we get in touch with you?
Well, the easiest way is if you go to himassager.com, HIMASSAGER.com. And if you go to himassager.com/freedom, there's a page that you can download. Well, actually, we got to finish the page, but soon there'll be a page that you'll be able to download a PDF program that outlines natural techniques and all the stuff that I meant to talk about, but rambled too much about other stuff. So that'll give you an outline of the big picture for that. And all of those, we reference High with that, but all of the techniques, everything else you can do at home. The biggest thing is just doing them, consistently doing them.
Yeah. Well, this was definitely a thought-provoking conversation for sure. Like, I feel like this was a great opportunity to really kind of understand some things that maybe I overlooked because of my age. And it's like, no, I think it's really important that we at least educate ourselves when we are in our 20s and 30s, that these things could come down the line. So protect your pelvic health and do the things that you know are going to help. And so thanks for kind of illuminating that for me and hopefully for other women that are watching as well, no matter what stage of life they're in. So for anyone tuning in, make sure to stick around because we have another amazing episode coming up here on the Women's Biohacking Conference.